Welcome to Chapter 12. This chapter will build on the knowledge that we learned in Chapters 10 and 11 in marketing, and with a particular emphasis on determining pricing using a cost-based pricing analysis. So in this chapter, we'll take a look at trying to understand the composition of an organization's cost base. And we'll take a look at the two basic types of costs, which are fixed and variable costs, and try to understand the relationship between variable and fixed costs and how they affect the organization's total cost structure. Once we've done that, we'll be able to understand the concept of break-even point in making some important business decisions. Once we've mastered the concept of break-even points, we'll be able to understand the value of recognizing what might be the optimal price point for a good or service to charge to the public. And we'll also take a look at some of the key impact factors that are associated with setting prices for various products and products and services within our organization. And we'll also do some quantitative problem analysis with a view of understanding break-even points and pricing. So when operating a business, one of the things that managers need to understand is their cost structure of their organization. So whether they're developing new strategies or making operating decisions, determining where and how to compete, understanding the costs within our organization, the cost to produce our goods or services, is critical. Important element of that is understanding the degree of control that managers might have over the various types of costs that are incurred. Some costs we might have a lot of control over, affecting those costs. Others we may find that we have minimal control. So it's important to understand not just what the cost structure is, but the degree of control that we have on those costs. Once we're able to understand the cost base of all costs within our organizations, we can better make some financial decisions in the event of unexpected changes in the market, demand increases or demand decreases, potential reductions in revenue that might come about, or any planned strategic shifts in our organization. So we really need to focus on the makeup of the cost base and as well understand how much control we have over each of those costs. We also need to understand what the market pressures are that will impact the cost base going forward. Things like inflation, things like pressure from suppliers on increasing prices, as well as downward pressure on prices in the market. We also need to understand the volume of production or volume of sales and dollar requirements necessary to achieve a break-even point, and we'll explore that more fully in this chapter. We need to understand the cost structure to understand what costs are good and that add value to our organization versus those costs that really add no value to our organization or to the end consumer, the end customer. And we also must understand our cost structure and comparing it to the cost base of others so that we may be able to see where we have some strengths and weaknesses compared to our competition. So in simple terms, when we talk about the cost base, we're talking about the total costs associated with the production and selling of goods and services to the final consumer. So that includes all costs right across the entire organization. So including manufacturing costs, distribution costs, marketing costs, selling costs, financing costs, administration, anything involved in the cost to produce that good or service. And once we've understood what the total costs are, we need to understand the behavior of those costs. How do those costs change with a change in the level of sales revenues, for instance? Do they change? Are they variable? Or are they fixed? And we'll take a little bit more of a look at the difference between direct and variable costs and fixed costs on the next slide. So in trying to understand the cost base of our organization, we really hope to identify two things. First of all, the percentage of costs that are considered to be direct or variable cost versus the percentage that are considered to be indirect or fixed costs. The second area of analysis is we want to understand the cost areas that make up a significant percentage of the overall cost base. So understanding not just what our costs are, but the behavior of those costs is critical to be able to make some decisions in our organization. So as we said, the total cost base of the organization is a combination of the direct or variable costs plus the indirect or fixed costs in our organization will tell us the total cost base of producing a good or a service. So let's take a look at some of the definitions of variable versus fixed. So let's take a look at the concept of variable costs. Sometimes variable costs are called direct costs. And these costs, variable costs, are costs that are directly tied to the manufacturing of a product or the delivery of a service in a service-based business. So if production of that good or service stopped being produced, these variable costs would disappear. So some examples of variable cost would include the materials for that go into inputs into our production process. They would include direct labor. So direct labor are the costs of our manufacturing employees, our factory employees, that those costs directly go into the cost of producing that good or service. Distribution costs, transportation costs often are considered variable costs because if we don't ship items to customers, our sales disappear, those costs would disappear as well. So variable costs are directly related to the sale or production of a good or service. Versus fixed costs are costs that are not directly tied to the manufacture of a product or delivery of a service. So they're the result of conducting business and operating the company. And typically fixed costs are not controllable in the very short term. Some examples of some of the fixed costs might include insurance costs, cost of utilities, interest on our debt, administration costs. Some salaries are considered as fixed costs because even if we're not producing, there might be some salaries that we are committed to pay, versus direct labor costs are typically variable. And if we don't produce or don't sell, we can eliminate the direct labor costs. Some salaries costs we cannot get rid of completely in the short term. So it's important to understand whether costs are variable, directly related to the production, or fixed costs where they're not directly related. Think of some of the overhead that you've heard of in business would be considered a fixed cost as well. Sometimes we have committed costs as well, where the organization is committed to costs over the short term, a year and that sort of thing. Some examples of that might be at the beginning of the year, we might sign an advertising contract for a fixed price of X number of dollars per year, or we might have a software agreement or a franchise agreement that needs to be paid irrespective of the level of sales. So typically, those committed costs are considered as fixed costs versus variable costs. So we really must understand the way that costs behave in our organization. Sometimes it's not that simple. Sometimes, for instance, utility costs might have a fixed cost component to keep the lights on and some basic amount of heat in our building, whether we are producing or not. And sometimes utility costs will have a variable cost component because the more we manufacture, the more equipment we use in the production process, we would expect the utility costs to increase as well. Sometimes even some of our employee costs might have a component of being fixed and variable as well. Sometimes our salespeople, for instance, we might pay a base salary plus a commission. So the base salary would be considered as a fixed cost. And then the commission, which is typically tied to their sales volumes, would be a variable component. So it's really important to analyze the behavior of all the costs in an organization to be able to make some business decisions going forward. We can take a look at the cost ladder, which explains the total cost right through the organization, right from the design and development to some of the costs for our raw materials, our manufacturing costs, distribution and transportation costs, the marketing costs, the administration. Those are examples of the total costs in our organization. And of course, to become profitable, we have to cover all of our costs, not just our variable costs, not just our fixed costs, but our total costs, plus have some room for our profit margin, which is the return for our efforts to our shareholders in determining the selling price. Here's a graph that helps us understand the behavior of variable and fixed costs in our organization. So this is on the y-axis is the dollar amount, and on the x-axis is either production or sales volume in terms of the number of units. So we can see our fixed costs essentially remain a constant dollar amount irrespective of the production or sales volume in our organization. So the fixed costs remain static. The variable costs increase in direct proportion to our production. So we can see that if we have no production or no sales, our variable costs are zero, and as we continue to produce, our variable costs increase. This line represents the total cost line. So it starts at the production of zero, which is the amount of our fixed costs, and increases directly in proportion to our sales volume or our production volume. So it's important to understand the behavior of our costs to be able to assess the degree of control we have over our products. Generally, the more variable the cost is, our cost structure is, we will have more control over costs, whereas the more fixed our cost structure is in the organization, we may mean that we have less control over that, hence more risk, and it's sometimes harder to adapt to changing market conditions when we have a very high level of fixed costs in our organization. Manufacturers typically will have more variable costs in their total cost structure, whereas some service and retailers will tend to have more fixed costs in their cost structure. So even small changes in sales for a retailer can have big impact on profits. In times when the economy is rather sluggish, organizations with greater variable costs in their cost structure will fare better because they can adapt easier. However, in times of prosperity, when the markets are good and sales volumes are very high, organizations with higher fixed costs will have greater impact on profits because the fixed costs are already covered. So every unit that is sold after our break-even point, when our fixed costs are covered, will generate higher profit margins to our total profits and hence increase return to shareholders. So it's really important to understand not just which fixed costs are variable and which are, which of our costs are variable and which costs are fixed, but the proportion of fixed costs to our variable costs in understanding the degree of control we might have over those costs. So again, just as a recap, Managers have to understand the composition of our total cost structure in order to manage those costs and adapt to changing markets. The more the cost is composed of variable costs, the more control that they will have on a daily basis. But the more the cost base is composed of fixed costs, the more difficult it is to use cost reduction strategies to protect the profitability of our company. As we say in manufacturing, organizations are probably more production focused and can respond fairly quickly to downturns in demand by reducing production. But in retail organizations or many service focused organizations, the ability to reduce costs with a reduction in sales is more difficult in the short term, as a higher percentage of their cost base is from fixed costs. So in general, we have more control over variable costs, and management must have the flexibility to adjust the cost base to respond to changing market conditions. So once we've understood the behavior of the costs in our organization, we can begin to do some analysis. And the first thing I want to introduce to you is the concept of break-even point. And break-even point is the level of sales revenue or the volume of production that's required to cover all of our costs. Hence, it's the point where the total revenue equals the total dollar cost. And in essence, we have a profit of $0. So its break-even point is really considered to be the minimum accepted position for the business in the short term. Because if we continue to operate with sales below the break-even point, we will continue to generate losses, and we won't be around for very long. While sales above the break-even point will contribute a profit to our organization. So it's really important to understand what sales volume is needed to reach the break-even point. And that's an important concept in business because we need to earn profits in the current period to sustain our long-term success in the organization. So when we're calculating break-even point, it's really a two-step process. The first is to estimate the total costs and determine if these costs are fixed or variable, so understanding the cost structure. And then we take that cost analysis and we can incorporate it then into our break-even point formula that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So if we want to take a look at a graphical example of our break-even point, so this is a continuation of the previous slide. So these are our fixed costs and these are our variable costs. And this is the line that represents our total costs, both variable and fixed in the organization. This green line represents our sales revenue. So it's really the price that we're charging per unit times the number of units sold. So if we have no sales and no production, of course, our revenue is zero at this point. For every unit we sell, it will increase by the amount of the sales price per unit. So it will increase in a linear fashion. At this point, we have our sales revenue, which is the green line, exactly equaling the total cost, so the total fixed and variable cost. So at this point, we have reached the break-even point. So at the break-even point, we do not have any profits. Our total revenues equals our total costs, hence we have a profit of zero. So the volume of sales then can be calculated to determine what sales volume we need to achieve, which would be this point on the graph, to reach our break-even point. And in terms of the number of units produced would be this point, which would represent the number of units we need to sell to reach our break-even point. After the break-even point, this area in between the revenue and total cost line represents our profit. So after the break-even point, for every unit that we sell, will generate a profit to our organization. So once we've understood the behavior of the cost in our organization, calculating the break-even point is relatively easy to do. And this is the critical formula, and a formula that I would expect you to know to determine what the break-even point is. So the break-even point in terms of the number of units of sales equals our total fixed costs divided by the selling price per unit less the variable cost per unit. So sometimes the selling price per unit versus less the variable cost per unit is something that's known as unit contribution. So in essence, the break-even point in terms of the number of units is the total fixed cost divided by the unit contribution. So once we know the break-even point in terms of the number of units, we can easily calculate the break-even point in terms of the sales dollars that we need to sell by taking the break-even point in units and multiplying by the selling price per unit. And that will tell us the break-even point in terms of the number of dollars we need to sell. So you should be able to do that as well. It's really important to understand that prices and costs will change over time. So managers really need to continually reassess the break-even point in order to understand how changes to our cost structure or the selling price will impact our break-even point in our organization. And we'll see the importance of that in a couple of the examples to follow. So keep in mind, the unit contribution is that denominator, the selling price per unit, less the variable cost per unit. And I'll use that term, unit contribution, as we go forward. We can also calculate the break-even point in terms of dollars, because sometimes we may not know the exact unit contribution, but we will know the variable cost percentage. And it may be unrealistic to compute break-even point on a per unit basis if we've got a large number of products and services that are being sold in our organization. So in those cases, it's easier to compute the break-even point based on the total sales revenue. And we can take a look at the formula of break-even point in dollars equals the total fixed cost divided by 1 minus the variable cost percentage. And the variable cost percentage, of course, would be the ratio variable costs divided by selling price per unit. So if the average amount spent by the customer is known, the break-even number can be translated into the number of customers that are needed to be served on an annual, weekly, daily, hour basis to achieve the required sales volume. So let's take a look at a problem that'll be an example of what we've learned so far in the course with respect to break-even. So here's the facts. We've got a manufacturer. They produce a product that costs $18 in materials per unit, $4 labor on a piece rate basis. What the piece rate basis means is that for every unit produced, we will pay $4 in labor. So it's directly related to the production and sales. Our product is sold for $40 per unit by a sales agent who's paid a 5% commission on all her sales. So we have a manufacturing plant, a modest facility that's rented for $6,000 per year, and the manufacturer spends $15,000 per year advertising the product. So this is one of those examples of a committed cost. We've got an advertising contract which costs us $15,000 per year. There's also a $4,000 annual royalty fee that must be paid to the inventor of the product for the right to use his idea. So given that information, these are the questions that we are going to work through. So you can kind of take a quick read through, and these are the type of questions or problems that you, as a manager of a business, might be faced with on a day-to-day basis. So let's take a look at solving for each of these questions. Okay, so let's take a look at the first part of the question. What are the variable costs per unit of producing and selling this product? So based on the information in our example, we know that the variable costs per unit are as follows. We had materials costs, which were $18 per unit. We had piece rate labor, which was defined as being $4 per unit. And we also had sales commission. We know the sales commission was a variable cost because it's based on the number of units sold. And the sales commission, we said, was 5% commission on the total sales. So if the sales price per unit is $40 per unit, as given in our example, the commission would be 5% of $40 or $2 per unit. So we know that the total variable cost per unit is $24. For every unit that's sold, it's going to cost us $24 in variable cost to sell that unit. So that's the total variable cost of producing and selling this product. So we also must understand what the total fixed costs are per year of producing and selling this product. So typically we will calculate the fixed costs on an annualized basis so that we can determine what the annual sales volume might be in terms of units or revenues. So if we take a look at the fixed costs in our example, we know that we had rent, which was a fixed cost. It has to be paid whether we sell a unit or not. We also had that committed advertising contract of $15,000 per year, so that is another fixed cost, and the royalty has to be paid whether we sell or produce anything at all to use the inventor's idea, so it's considered a fixed cost. So we have total fixed cost of $25,000 per year. So now we've got a good understanding of the behaviors of our costs in our organization, so that we should be able now to calculate the unit contribution on sales of this product. The unit contribution equals the selling price per unit less the variable cost per unit. So in our example, the selling price was $40. We calculated the variable cost per unit over here of $24. So the unit contribution is $16 per unit. So what that means is for every unit that we sell for $40, the first $24 goes to pay as the variable cost to produce that product, and we have $16 left over. That $16 goes to, first of all, cover the fixed costs in our organization. And then, after the break-even point, that $16 per unit will generate profit. So it first goes to contributing towards fixed costs, and after we've covered all our fixed costs or past the break-even point, that $16 will be the profit per unit in our hypothetical company. So once we've understood what our total fixed costs are and our total variable costs are, we can now calculate the break-even point, both in terms of the number of units and in terms of the number of dollars in sales. So let's take a look at the break-even point in terms of the number of units. We know that from our formula, the break-even point in terms of the number of units equals the total fixed costs divided by the unit contribution. And we know both of those factors because we calculated on the previous slide our fixed costs of $25,000 $25,000. And we know that our unit contribution now is $16 per unit. So that means our break-even point in terms of the number of units is 25,000 divided by 16, or 1,562 and 1/2 units. So we now know to generate a profit of 0, to cover all our variable costs, to cover our fixed costs, we need to sell 1,562.5 units. So we'll keep in mind that's our break-even point, so we still have a profit of 0. We can also calculate the break-even point in terms of sales dollars. So the break-even point in terms of dollars equals our fixed costs divided by 1 minus the variable cost percentage. So in our example, our fixed costs remain the same of $25,000. And the 1 minus variable cost percentage is total variable cost, which you calculated as $24 per unit divided by the sales price, $40 per unit. So by solving for that formula, we can determine that the sales level that is required to achieve a break-even point is $62,500. We could have also calculated the break-even point because we know that we need to sell 1,562.5 units. We can multiply that by the sales price of $40 per unit, and we could have also calculated the break-even point in terms of sales dollars by taking the break-even point in terms of units times the sales price per unit of $40 equals $62,500. So you should be able to calculate the break-even point and sales volumes either from our formula, or if we know the number of units, it's sometimes a little bit easier to multiply by the sales price to determine the break-even point in sales dollars. So now that you've got a good understanding of how to calculate the break-even point, both in terms of the number of units and sales, we can start using that to make some business decisions or some what-if analysis. So in this example, let's say now the manufacturer is considering increasing the annual spending on advertising to $17,500. So in our first example, we had an advertising contract for $15,000. Now he's considering increasing it to $17,500. And what will that decision do to our break-even point in our organization? So the question is, what percentage increase does this decision cause in total fixed costs per year? So because now our fixed costs increase from increase to $27,500 from $25,000 due to the $2,500 increase in our advertising contract, this represents a 10% increase in our total fixed costs. So that should be fairly easy to understand from the formula. Given a $2,500 increase is a 10% increase in fixed costs. But more importantly, how does that change affect our annual break-even volume in terms of units and sales? And what is the percentage increase in the break-even numbers if we increase our advertising spending? So now, as we determined, our new advertising budget represents a 10% increase in total cost. This also increases the break-even point in our business to 1,719 units from 1,562.5 units, which is an increase of 10% in terms of the number of units. As well, our break-even in terms of sales volume increases to $68,750 from the $62,500 we previously calculated, which again is a 10% increase in from our previously calculated break-even point in terms of sales dollars. So you can go through and do the calculations for yourself, but in this example, an increase of 10% in fixed costs led to an increase in our break-even point of 10%, both in terms of sales volume, sales dollars, as well as the number of units that needs to be sold. Okay, so let's take a look at another what-if scenario. Um, in our first example, we needed to increase our sales volume, so we took a look at increasing our our advertising budget by 10%, and we saw that that led to a 10% increase in the break-even point in terms of sales and in terms of the number of units that we need to sell. But let's say instead the manufacturer is considering reducing the selling price of our product by 10% instead of increasing the annual advertising budget in an attempt to attract more sales. So if that was the decision, how would this change affect our annual break-even point in terms of the number of units sold and in terms of the dollars, and what percentage increase does that represent? So that's our dilemma. That's the problem that we're going to solve. This one's a little bit more complicated because changing our selling price, reducing our selling price by 10% is going to affect our unit contribution. So let's take a look at the total variable cost per unit in this example. Our materials costs haven't changed. They're still $18 per unit. Our labor rate hasn't changed. It's still $4 per unit. But what has changed is our sales commission, because now our sales price has been dropped from $40 to $36 per unit, and our sales commission is 5% of the sales price. So 5% times our selling price now of $36 per unit is $1.80. So our total variable costs then have become $23 per unit. So our unit contribution is our new selling price of $36 per unit less our new variable costs per unit of $23.80. So we have a unit contribution of $12.20. So this decision to reduce our selling price actually affected the total variable costs as well as the unit contribution. So what does that do to our annual break-even point in terms of the units and dollars? So our break-even point in terms of units, so our formula hasn't changed. It's the fixed cost divided by our unit contribution, and that's just an abbreviated way of writing that formula. Our fixed costs haven't changed. They're still $25,000. Our new unit contribution from here is now $12.20 per unit. So now we must sell 2,049 units to reach our break-even point. To calculate our break-even point in terms of the sales volume, here's our formula: fixed costs divided by 1 minus the variable cost percentage. Our fixed costs are still 25,000. Our denominator changes a little bit because our variable cost percentage is now $23.80 divided by our new selling price of $36 per unit. So by calculating the formula, our break-even point in terms of sales volume has now increased to $73,770.49. So what's happened is our break-even point in terms of units increased to 2,049 units from the 1,562.5 units that we previously calculated, which is an increase of 31.1%. So now we need to sell 31% more units to reach our break-even point because we reduced our selling price by 10%. Or in terms of dollars, our break-even point increased to $73,770.49 from the previously calculated $62,500, which is an increase of 18%. So our sales, in terms of sales revenues, must go up by 18% to reach our break-even point because we reduced our price of our product by 10%. So the moral of the story is be very, very cautious when looking at increasing demand by decreasing our sales price, because it can have an exponential effect on the break-even point, both in terms of the number of units sold and the number of sales revenue that is required to break even. So be cautious when adjusting your unit contribution. Know the implications on how it may affect your business. Okay, it's important to understand how we can use break-even point in understanding profit objectives in our organization, or how profit expectations can affect our break-even point. We all know that if we don't achieve sales revenues in excess of the break-even point, we will incur losses in organizations, and that will eventually lead to insolvency, and we won't be able to survive very long if we do. And managers really don't want to just achieve break-even point. They, of course, want to achieve a profit and hence a return for our shareholders. So we can take a look at enhancing our break-even formula that we've learned so far to enable the organization to see the sales volume requirements of a certain profit objective. So here we can take a look at our formula and modify it a little bit to include the break-even point plus our profit objective in terms of the dollars equals our total fixed cost plus the profit objective as our numerator, and divide by the same denominator, which is our selling price per unit less the variable cost per unit, or our unit contribution. So we can calculate not just the break-even point, but the break-even point plus our profit objective, which might be more relevant to many businesses. Second of all, we can also calculate the break-even point in terms of the dollars required, or sales revenues required, by taking our break-even point plus our profit expressed in terms of dollars equals, as the numerator, total fixed cost plus profit divided by 1 minus the variable cost percentage. So all we're doing is amending our initial break-even formula for units and sales dollars by adding in the profit expectation, so that we can now know the number of units or the number of sales that we need to generate to achieve our profit expectations for our business. We can also expand our break-even formula to determine what sales level of requirement is required to meet our full operating costs, as well as our profit objective, as well as make any principal repayment on any debt that's required. So we can also include the amount of principal payments on our debt, not interest, because that'll be used in the cost structure, but the principal payments can be included to expand our formula. Here's our formula from before, the break-even point in terms of dollars plus profit. Also include the debt repayment equals our total fixed cost plus our profit objective plus our debt repayment as the numerator, divided by 1 minus the variable cost percentage as our denominator as before. And so now we will know what level of sales we need to generate to meet our break-even point, cover all our costs, plus generate a certain profit, plus repay or allow us sufficient profits to make the principal payments on our debt. And that might be something that you as an entrepreneur or a business person really wants to understand. How much in sales do I need to cover my costs, generate a profit, and keep the banker happy? So you should be able to expand the break-even point and do some calculations to assist you in understanding what level of sales to cover all those costs. So now that you've become a master at understanding the break-even point, the break-even point can also be used to assist managers to understand how to determine what might be the optimal price point, or OPP, to charge for the goods and services that we offer for sale to our customers. This is sometimes also known as cost-based or cost-plus pricing. So the optimal price point equals the total variable cost plus our total fixed cost plus our profit objective divided by the quantity produced and expected to be sold. So to determine the optimum price point, we need to consider other factors as well. For instance, is that price competitive with other similar products that have been introduced by our competitors in the marketplace? Is it acceptable to the distributors who we will rely on to distribute our product to the customers? And when the distributors add their markup, will the price be accepted by our customers? And is that price point, that final price point for customers, is it in agreement with our brand position and what we want to achieve in the marketplace? So when we talk about markup, we're talking about the addition to the manufacturer's price that a distributor will add to ensure that their direct and indirect costs are covered and ensure that they are meeting a certain profit threshold as well. So we should not be so naive as to assume that the optimum price point is the only price point that can be used for a product as it enters the market, because often trade-offs have to be made in the market. So let's take a look at the concept of optimal price point in a quick example on the following slide. Oops. So here, just remember that the optimum price point is the total variable cost plus the total fixed cost plus our profit requirement divided by the quantity produced and estimated. So in our example, let's say you've developed a new smart phone and you're ready to launch your product. You've developed this product and tested it and ready to introduce it to the market. So our fixed costs were $20 million. The variable costs per unit are $75 per unit to produce one unit of your smartphone. You have the capacity in your manufacturing plant to produce 400,000 smartphones, and your market research suggests that there's sufficient market demand to be able to sell all of those. So we want to determine two things. First, what is our optimum price point that we as manufacturer will require to generate a profit of $4 million because we need to satisfy our investors and give them a return on their capital. Second thing we want to understand is if the distributor of our phone requires a markup of 120%, what price will consumers have to pay for our product, and is that price competitive with other smartphones in the market? Will we be successful? So let's take a look at the solution. So our basic formula is the optimum price point equals our variable costs plus our fixed costs plus our profit objective divided by the quantity that we expect to produce and sell in of our smartphone. So by filling in what we know from the information given, our optimum price point equals our total variable costs, which are $75 per unit times the 400 units, or 400,000 units that we expect to produce, plus our fixed costs of $20 million, plus our profit objective of $4 million. And that becomes our numerator. We already said that the quantity produced and sold, or our denominator, is 400,000 units. So by simply solving for that equation, we determine that the optimum price point is $135. So that's the optimum price point to meet to cover all of our fixed and variable costs and our profit objective. We need to be able to sell that our cell phone to the distributor for $135. So we must consider whether that price is competitive and is it accepted by our distributors, and is that price consistent with our branding strategies. So given that the manufacturer, our optimum price point is $135, we have to take a look at the markup. And again, the markup is the amount added by the distributors to the cost to determine the final price to the customer. So in our example, we said that the markup was 120% of the cost. So this is the requirement for the distributor. He is going to mark up the price of the smartphone by 120% of their cost, which is $135. That was our optimum price point, or $162. So the price to the consumer now becomes the $135. That is the cost to the distributor plus the $162 that the distributor requires to cover their fixed and variable costs. So the final price to the consumer now is $297. So now we must stop and think, is that price to be reasonable in terms of what our competitors are selling the product for in the market? Will it be viable in the market? Is it consistent with our branding strategies? If not, we may need to go back to the table and perhaps negotiate with our distributors, see if there's ways to reduce our variable costs, or do we have to reassess our profit objectives and or perhaps the quantity produced and sold to determine whether this is a viable concept before we go to the market. So just an example how we can use the concept of optimum price point as well as markup to make some business decisions when taking a look at introducing a new product into the market. And this is an example of cost plus pricing. So let's take a little bit more of a detailed look at this concept of markup and how the concept of markup can affect the final price to consumers. As we know, retail organizations that buy finished goods and reselling those products need to really understand the costs incurred in the purchase and delivery of the finished goods to the marketplace. And just like manufacturing operations, retailers need to ensure that the full cost recovery and profit objectives are being met. And so one way of doing this is taking a look at the concept of step-up pricing, and we'll take a look at an example of step-up pricing in the next slide. But in markup or step-up pricing, all the fixed costs such as marketing, selling, and admin expenses, warehousing, leases, wages, benefits of the retail and distribution staff are all added to the direct costs of the retail product, as well as a profit objective added to the total cost to determine the final price that's selling to that would be sold to customers. Keep in mind that irrespective of the step-up pricing, that all our pricing decisions can't be made in isolation because we must be considering at all times competition and what their points are, as well as the willingness of the market to pay a certain price for our good or service. So let's take a look at an example that illustrates the concept of markup pricing or step-up pricing. So in our example, we've got a shirt that is produced by a manufacturer in Thailand, and the cost of that shirt from the manufacturer is $6. We also know that we have some additional costs to get the product imported from Thailand, transportation costs, perhaps some packaging and labeling costs of another $6. So now the total cost becomes $12, $6 for the cost of the shirt plus another $6 for the transportation, importation, and product preparation charges. We also have a markup of 30% to cover the fixed costs. So our variable costs are $12 per unit now, and we also must cover our fixed costs. So let's say we have a markup of 150% to cover off our indirect costs. So these are our fixed costs for operating the business. And in our example, the markup is 150%. So we will take the markup is $12, which is the cost of the product as we determined over here, times 1.5, and add that to the cost of the product. So now our price would appear to be $30, which covers all our fixed costs and variable costs. However, what we haven't incorporated into our pricing scheme yet is the profit objective. And so let's say we've got a 15% markup to meet our profit objective. So our total costs were $30 plus another markup of 15% times the cost of $30, or $4.50. So our suggested selling price now becomes $34.50 for the cost of that $6 shirt that was produced by the manufacturer in Thailand. So we've gone from $6 up to $34.50 to cover all of our variable costs, to cover all our fixed costs, plus a 15% profit objective. So we can also use this same methodology to determine the final price in the market by adding in the markups required by wholesalers and retailers along the distribution channel. So that's the concept of step-up pricing or markup pricing, and how it increases throughout the supply chain. So as we know, various retailers will often charge different prices for goods and services. Some of them might use a price discounting strategy where they will reduce the price of a product with the intent of increasing the volume of products being sold. So while the profit margin for an individual product might decrease, their overall profitability will increase because they make it up in volume. So they're trying to get a larger market share. Sometimes retailers will use a price skimming strategy, and that's actually inflating the price of the product, perhaps because it connotates value or some sort of exclusivity. Perhaps they can charge higher prices based on the brand loyalty that they've received. Perhaps they provide superior service. So price skimming is using a premium price strategy to maximize the profit margin on the sale of each individual product. Sometimes retailers will use something that's called psychological pricing, and that's the use of pricing tactics that are designed to respond to psychological tendencies of purchasers. For example, sometimes the price of $12, an even price, sounds a lot better, or sounds higher than a price of $11.99. So that's an example of a psychological pricing tactic. Sometimes we'll use seasonal adjustments, i.e. at the beginning of the spring, for instance, a lot of lawn and garden products have higher prices on them, and of course they are reduced towards the end of the season to meet consumer expectations. So various retailers will use different psychological pricing tactics in determining the price of a good or service. Sometimes retailers will use a temporary price reduction called a rebate in an attempt to stimulate sales, typically over a short period of time. So that might be, the mail-in coupons that we get, or quantity discounts to buy on large quantities as well. Sometimes retailers will be able to charge different prices because they have heavier bargaining power and are able to negotiate lower prices with the perhaps wholesalers and retailers. Sometimes they have better distribution systems, which will reduce some of their fixed and variable costs. And some organizations, such as Walmart, have pricing strategies designed to be the lowest price, and with the expectation that they're able to make it up on the volume. So let's take a look at different pricing strategies for 3 different retailers. All these retailers sell the same product which is a refrigerator that they buy directly from the manufacturer. Each of these retailers have different policies on standard markups, as well as different profit objectives, and will use a combination of, or some of them may use rebates or sales promotion discounts to generate increased sales. So let's take a look at our first retailer. Our first retailer is a high-end retailer of furniture and appliances. And they purchase the product from the manufacturer for a cost of $600. They have a standard markup of 20% of the price that they pay for that refrigerator, so 200% of the $300 cost. So they have a standard markup of $600. So now the cost between the cost plus their standard markup is now $900. They have a 20% profit objectives of the $900 cost to them, which is $180. And they also offer a $100 in-store rebate. So if we subtract the $100, the final price to the consumer for retailer one is $980. Our second retailer is a big box store, and it relabels the products that they receive under their own brand. So perhaps a store like the Brick, or perhaps even Sears. Because they do a large volume of business, they're able to negotiate a better price for the base model refrigerator. And so they only pay $270 as opposed to $300 that other competitors might pay for the same item. They have a standard markup of 160%. So 160% times $270, which is their cost from the manufacturer, is $432. So they've got a total cost now of $702. They've got a 10% profit objective times that $702, which is $70.20. So if we add all of those together, they're able to sell that same refrigerator for $772.20 at the second retailer. The third retailer is a specialty appliance store, and it buys the product from the manufacturer, again, for $300. It has a policy of having a standard markup of 180%. They've got trained staff. They offer full installation, follow-up service, extended warranty. So they do offer some other benefits, and they have a standard markup of 180%. So the total cost then becomes $540. So 180% times 300 is $540. Plus the $300 is $840. They've got a 15% profit objective, so 15% times $840 is another $126. But they also offer a 10% discount on the price. So the total cost to now is $966, so less 10% or $96.60. So they're able to offer a price to the consumer of $869. So we can see that different retailers will have different pricing strategies. They will have different bargaining power. They will have different profit objectives and different policies on granting either rebates or discounts in the store. And so that can affect the final price that the consumer will pay. So an interesting example of how pricing strategies can affect the final price to consumers. Pricing is becoming very difficult in the market for many retailers. With the opening up of the global marketplace and the explosion of online buying and selling, challenges associated with pricing are more than ever before. And so pricing decisions have to be more fluid and dynamic and constantly monitored. And there's really four fundamental things that you should consider when setting the price for the good or service. So first of all, of course, is the total cost base of the price of the product or service that we're delivering. We also must consider the value that our business brings to the consumer. So sometimes we can charge higher prices because of the brand reputation we have, the quality of our service, the reliability of our product, the ease of access. So we must always be aware of the actual and the perceived value that the customer considers in buying our good or service. We also have to consider the price sensitivity of the product and service in the market. How elastic is the price? How elastic is the demand in the market? And we must also consider how effective our marketing efforts are to communicate our competitive advantage, the quality of our product, and why we stand apart. So we must consider those when determining the final price that we might offer for our goods and services. We also must anticipate or expect contingencies and establish reserves for the replacement of capital assets. So we need to be profitable enough so that we're able to upgrade our plant and facilities and equipment and cover off any contingencies that come about. And we also must be cognizant of debt repayment obligations and inflation, which are two factors that can creep up the cost of producing goods and services in our organization. We also have to consider future growth and make sure we are getting sufficient reserves so that we can continue to grow and develop new products. So lots of factors to consider in pricing that you as a manager need to consider and monitor all these changes throughout the life cycle of the product. So again, just a quick example of all the things that you need to consider in determining the required price, not just our variable costs, not just our fixed costs, but also considering contingencies, debt repayment, inflation, equipment replacement, depreciation, amortization, as well as future needs, which might be product and service development, research and development, contingencies, before we can determine the appropriate price to charge for our goods and services in the market. So remember that revenues is the result of the price times the quantity sold. And it's really the core source of dollars that an organization has at its disposal to finance future growth and product development. If we do not generate sufficient profitability to grow, to replace capital assets, to cover research and development, or we have to look towards getting those sorts of funds externally, perhaps through sale of shares or debt, which can also drive up the costs of our goods and services. So keep in mind that pricing decisions can't be made in a vacuum. You know, we need to consider our costs, we need to consider what the competition is doing, as well as what the customer expects and what the maximum price point might be that customers will be willing to pay. So we have to remember that customers will have a maximum price point. They will have different preferences. They will perceive different value in the quality and reliability of our product. Behavioral issues might affect price and the volume of sales in terms of the quantity and regularity that the consumers will buy our goods and services. And of course, the number of different product substitutes or alternatives or options that are available to customers has to be considered as well. So overall, once a price is set, the process really doesn't end. We really have to be on top of it and consider reassessment of profitability, costs, and competitive conditions all the time, because these will change daily, they will change weekly and monthly. So we need to be on top of what's happening in the market. So another way to take a look at pricing is to take a look at the total cost, add in our profit margin, and hopefully as an organization we're able to create some additional value for customers and actually charge a higher price, so that the perceived value of the customer provides not only a profit margin and covers our costs, but adds some flexibility in there as well. So, so another look at how pricing is determined in the market. The more effective our marketing initiatives are, and the more effective we are at communicating value, whether it be real value or perceived value, in the delivery of a product or service, can influence our ability to charge a higher price. So if we're very good at creating that real or perceived value in the minds of customers, price becomes less important, and we will be able to sell a higher price. But if we fail to deliver that message that creates that value in the minds of customers, we may be faced with the continual price pressures to reduce prices to keep customers buying our product. And we become very responsive to price pressures and being forced to reduce pricing to be able to sell goods and services in the marketplace. So just a recap of the overall pricing process, making sure we have a good understanding of our profit objectives. We understand the current, what's happening in the current market, what consumers will pay, analyze our costs, potential volume for sales, evaluate our different pricing options, the value proposition, the strengths, the marketing message that we're able to do, and initiate a recommended price, and make sure that we're continually evaluating and adjusting our pricing strategies given the reaction of the market, given market shifts, changes to the dynamic business environment, the macroeconomic environments, the changes within our organization. All will have an impact on setting prices for our business. So remember, pricing decisions can't be made in a vacuum. We have to consider growth, we have to consider profits, and make sure that we understand how pricing decisions will affect our ultimate profitability in our organization. So again, review some of these key concepts identified in this chapter. Take a look at the quantitative problems. Go through, make sure you understand the concepts presented with respect to pricing and break-even analysis in this chapter. Don't try to memorize those problems, but fully understand what they mean so that you can apply some of those concepts to making business decisions in this course and in your future courses.